Okay, thank you, Jakob, and I'd like to thank everybody for the invitation and for tuning in today. I take it that you can hear my audio okay, and see the slides. Okay. So what I will talk about today is the idea and the historical moment of austerity urbanism, which was a moment, I suppose, identified in the wake of the global financial crash of 2008, where attention was focused, at least by urbanists and geographers, but also by some other commentators, on the disproportionately severe effects of the financial crisis on cities and local municipalities. So if I can, let me see if I can, okay, there we are. This first graph gives you a sense of how austerity emerged as a zeitgeist word in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis. It's a rather kind of obscure term that wasn't in widespread circulation prior to 2008. This is the incidence in major newspapers from the US and the UK. And you can see the spike in austerity, talk of austerity occurs just after the crash. In the Northern Hemisphere and in Europe in particular, austerity was one of the key words of the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And in fact, the word austerity was the most looked up word in American dictionaries in 2010. So this was a word which didn't necessarily have any technical or everyday meaning for many. And so it acquired its meaning, or acquired a particular meaning in the aftermath of the crisis. So what I want to talk about today is what are we to make of this austerity moment immediately following the Wall Street crash? Do we consider this to be a new phase of neoliberalism? Do we consider it to be a repeat of the earlier periods of public sector cutbacks and financial restraint, such as those experienced in the early 1980s in the UK and the United States under Reagan and Thatcher? Does it signal in some way an end game or working out of the final contradictions of neoliberalism? Or is it something else altogether? I think this was a phenomena that calls for political and theoretical explanations that may not be within the current toolkit, as it were. So one exception, and I should say that I'm primarily going to talk about the United States today, and knowingly so, even though I'm from the UK originally and work currently in Canada. Most of my work in the last 20 years has been focused on the US. And I think the US case is an interesting one in the context of austerity, because it was there that austerity seemed to be an alien phenomena in many respects. Most Americans in 2008 regarded austerity as a European word and a European affliction. It was something that happened to you if you had an overlarge welfare state and high rates of taxation. It was something that you had to face during periods of economic contraction. So austerity had little currency in the American context, and yet I would argue, and this was an argument that Paul Krugman also made in the New York Times, that austerity is the de facto policy of the United States, even if it's not named as a phenomenon, and is almost so naturalized and normal there that the word barely needs to be used. However, one exception is this American political commentator, centrist political commentator Thomas Edsall, who in a book published just after the crash made this argument. We've entered a period of austerity markedly different from anything we've seen before. A brutish future stands before us. The politics of scarcity favour the right, which is better equipped ideologically than the left to inflict the hardship measures a sustained economic crisis invites. Nonetheless, Republicans in power have frequently overestimated their mandate, forfeiting public support. So this, I think, basic observation here is an important one, in that at times of fiscal cutbacks and public sector restraint present political opportunities for parties of the right. It's a political environment in which parties of the right can thrive and pursue many of their longer term objectives with the following wind, if you will, of a financial emergency. The left, on the other hand, or the centre left in power, finds periods of austerity a difficult time for significant governmental action. It's nearly impossible to finance new programmes. There's a general culture of restraint on taxation and on spending. So it has a asymmetrical political effect almost built into the nature of austerity. And it was clear that the right in the United States took full advantage of the opportunities that the austerity moment after 2008 presented. This shifty-looking character here is from the conservative Manhattan Institute, one of the leading neoliberal and neoconservative think tanks in the United States. His name is Stephen Eade, and he's making the argument here that the austerity moment is one in which Republican state governments can discipline their cities in their jurisdictions, especially since the majority of state governments were in Republican control, while most big cities would be under a Democratic mayor. And so this is Stephen Eade writing about the opportunity that austerity presented. The most serious threats to city budgets, excessive debt, political dysfunction and soft tax bases are not going away anytime soon. To prevent more Detroits, and Detroit, of course, was the most famous city bankruptcy of this period, state governments should rein in local officials' ability to make bad fiscal decisions. If we want stronger cities, we should support more state-imposed constraints on them. Oh, I'm losing control of my screen here. Tough decisions will be necessary to forestall local insolvency. Distance from local political pressures, state governments are more likely than local governments to make such decisions. States need to step in Caesar-like earlier and more vigorously. And so this is a ideologically neoliberal think tank advocating aggressive action to take over city administrations, to put them in financial receivership, to use authoritarian measures to control cities' spending and tax behaviour. And so this is, on the one hand, an example of rank political opportunism, but it also shows some of the ways in which you see a kind of rethinking of the neoliberal line in the context of the opportunity of a period of austerity. And in this case, a rather contorted argument to support heavy-handed intervention on the part of states in city budgeting, which normally would be sacred to neoliberal reformers who would otherwise normally argue for maximum local flexibility, to autonomy from outside state interference and so on. So the right was manoeuvring to take advantage of these circumstances. So let me just say a little bit about what austerity means in theoretical, political and institutional terms. Again, thinking about this from the perspective of the United States, but recognizing that it also has a broader reach and resonance. So one way to capture this austerity moment, and the way that I would advocate, is to place it in the context of ongoing processes of neoliberalization. And I use the term neoliberalization deliberately there rather than neoliberalism, because neoliberalization denotes an ongoing rolling process of transformation. I would argue, and a lot of the work of radical geographers makes this a similar kind of point, that neoliberalism shouldn't be confused with an end state or static condition. What it is a label for a process of transformation with an uncertain destination. So neoliberalization as a rolling process of transformative change is always, by definition, incomplete. It's an incompletable utopian political project. But in its very utopian nature, inspires or gives direction to political and social forces. It indicates a direction of change and strategic targets, even if we will never live in the world of free markets and perfect individual freedoms. So the way that neoliberalism works, I would argue, is that it works as an ideology, or what Pierre Bourdieu called a strong discourse that invokes direction and purpose and hails leadership, even if we'll never live in that completely neoliberalized world, even if the very process of neoliberalization always generates contradictions, resistance, and so on, which means that you'll never arrive at that destination. So this means that I would argue that we need to see neoliberalism then not as some condition that we can summarize as a set of policy goals, but as a kind of moving political project that is always contextual, historically and geographically, always taking advantage or exploiting circumstances. So there's a number of implications of this. It means that there is no linear path to complete neoliberalism. There's no such thing as a kind of small state equilibrium that eventually the state can be cut back far enough that things will be perfectly imbalanced from a neoliberal point of view. The neoliberal reformers never know when to stop. They only have a kind of license for constant transformation. And that's one of the reasons that they nearly always go too far, or nearly always can cause considerable institutional and social damage in their restructuring programs, but they're destined always to be frustrated. So for these reasons, I believe we should never talk about degrees of neoliberalism. That's a completely wrong-headed way of looking at the phenomena. This is a matter of qualitative transformation. And it's not simply the case that the United States is more neoliberal than the United Kingdom or France or Brazil or Australia. It's not simply a matter of amount, it's a matter of political analysis, the content of these neoliberal reform processes. Another thing to say is that neoliberalism, rather than a linear path, follows a zigzagging, crisis-ridden course. Its programs are always frustrated, always limited. One of the reasons that neoliberal reformers themselves always seem to be angry and dissatisfied is that they can never get to the destination that they see in their own imagination. They always see themselves surrounded by enemies and obstacles. And so in a perverse way, the more unrealistic neoliberal discourse is, the more effective it is at actually inspiring ongoing political action. And it's associated with a predictable list of the usual suspects of the enemies of neoliberalism, unions, bureaucrats, social movements, and so on, who would always be blamed for any failure to attain neoliberal goals. So this means then that I think we can look at post-2008 and this austerity moment as a moment in this moving process, a moment which is different to earlier austerity moments, which has got its own lineage, its own geographies and so on. So there's not one standard experience, even within the United States, and Greek austerity and European austerity is a different experience altogether from the American experience and so on. So we have to analyze this as a specific phenomena, but one connected, I would argue, to a series of generic restructuring strategies and tendencies within the neoliberalization process. So amongst these, we would say that fiscal purging, especially of the social state, is a recurrent condition in neoliberal reform. But each round of cuts, especially in cutbacks in the public sector, has been distinctive. To put it most simply, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were imposing their cuts to an inherited Keynesian welfare state of very different kinds, of course, in those two countries. The austerity moment of 2008, austerity is being applied to an already deeply neoliberalized state structure. And that's a very different thing. You're cutting a different kind of state. You can think of austerity as like a medieval doctor applying the leeches to suck the blood out of the patient. Now, it's a different patient in 2008 to 1978. And at one level, that's obvious. But I think that means that even if you're applying some of the same treatments, you're applying them to a different social body. So in that context, we can also ask how we might locate austerity in the context of other long-run transformative political economic processes, such as financialization. Financialization has accompanied neoliberalization. Both have intensified and have fed one another in the period since the 1970s. I would argue that they have each got their own dynamics. They're not entirely reducible to one another. And so we can also capture the austerity moment, I think, in terms of an ongoing process of financialized urban governance. And I'll say a little bit about that in a few minutes. So next, what does austerity mean politically? Again, these are partly generic comments, and some of them apply to the specifics of the crisis in the United States. Austerity is a moment of redistribution, but a moment of regressive redistribution. Austerity is usually something that the powerful do to the less powerful. It's about shifting the blame and the costs of economic crisis onto the most vulnerable in society, often onto local administrations rather than central ones, onto the poor rather than the rich, onto marginalized communities as well. And so we should see austerity as a redistributive process associated with a series of regressive redistributions. Crucially, in the period after the financial crash of 2008, austerity was also a way of re-narrating the crisis, of turning what began clearly as a banking crisis into a crisis of and for the social state. That involved a major task of discursive reinvention and reconstruction to transform the story about the crisis of 2008 into a story that is about the pensions of school teachers and firefighters in the Midwest, not a story about bankers in New York City and London and elsewhere. And so that re-narration of the crisis has occurred in this austerity moment, which again redirects the object of reform and transformation onto the state itself. That discursive project was associated with a whole series of what I would characterize as push politics, advocacy on the part of think tanks, especially to provide new narrative resources and strategies for reformers, to enable conservative and neoliberal reformers especially to take maximum advantage of these conditions. And so we saw new narrations of urban and social state crisis being generated in the wake of the Wall Street crash. And in the US case, and to varying degrees elsewhere, the targets were set up as these three Ps. There was an attack on public sector unions, which is still ongoing, an attack on pensions, especially pension funds held in the public sector, and new waves of privatization. So these were the imperative responses to the financial crash of 2008. And what that anticipated was a future of leaner, meaner local government and a whole series of small state crises. Now, what does this mean institutionally? This is where we get more to the specifics of the American case. What austerity conditions mean is that budgetary constraint in the public sector becomes the operating matrix for political action and governmental action in particular. In the American model of federalism, cuts tend to cascade down from the top. So fiscal restraint amongst the federal government level, that's passed down to the states pass it down to the cities and local municipalities. So the pain of cuts tends to cascade down through the federal system. In the US, cities and municipalities are creatures of state government. They have limited room for maneuver independently of their states. States are not allowed to declare bankruptcy in the United States, but local government entities can. And so, again, Detroit is the most famous case of a municipal bankruptcy in the wake of 2008, but there were several others. The model that is used in the United States to govern these relationships is known as fiscal federalism. This is based on the principle of devolved self-sufficiency. So units of government, say a city administration, should be able to live within its means within a context of very limited progressive redistribution. So fiscal federalism is a legal and political doctrine that decrees that each unit of local government has to internalize the costs and benefits of its own activities. It's the opposite of Keynesian redistribution. It says that every unit of government should live within its means and should not rely on transfers from other levels of government. Another aspect of fiscal federalism is tax and spending restrictions are imposed in a downward scalar direction. And so states will often impose tax and spending restrictions on cities and municipalities. This again is a phenomena of the neoliberal period. There were no tax and spending restrictions on cities in the 1970s. By the early 1990s, 25 of the 50 US states were imposing restrictions on cities' ability to raise tax or increase spending. Today, the large majority of states impose those restrictions. So this means then that fiscal discipline and the impact of cuts tends to trickle down the interstate system. And we can again position this in the broader logic of the shift away from Keynesian to neoliberal modes of governance. The old logic that held maybe through to the 1970s, based on the Keynesian principles of redistributive transfers, was largely anti-cyclical and within limits progressively redistributive. So local poorer cities would receive transfers at a higher rate than wealthy cities. Today, we've moved to a model of state and local government financing, which is based on private debt going to the bond markets to raise funds, and has become strongly pro-cyclical as opposed to anti-cyclical. So this is just a summary of what happened in the wake of the financial crash. This is what states did. The number along the bottom is the 50 US states. And you can see here that the most typical strategies were significant spending cuts. They're the red bars. Nearly every state imposed immediate across the board cuts in spending, which it imposed on its cities and municipalities. Many states targeted the cuts in certain ways. Most of them also raided their rainy day funds. Many states, these blue bars reflect the restructuring of state workforces. layoffs, salary cuts, early retirement schemes. The purple bars are a range of governmental restructuring efforts, reorganizing and privatizing activities, reducing aid to localities and cities. And then in the light blue bars, you've got a number of fees and sin taxes, essentially maneuvers that states would adopt to try to increase revenues without increasing business or income taxes. So a range of financial measures which were used by state financial managers to try to maintain balanced budgets. Okay, so you've got cuts, workforce rationalization, and various fees and sin taxes. Now, as I've mentioned, this means that the effects of austerity tend to trickle down to the local level. This is what Pew, a major charitable agency, called the 1-2 punch, hitting cities of falling revenues while need for social spending increased. Historic reductions in fiscal transfers intensified during the period after the crash, and many cities found themselves caught between a low or flat tax base and mandates against deficit spending. Most are barred from running deficits by law, and so you have to balance the books on an annual cycle. There's some accounting tricks you can use, but essentially cuts have to be imposed immediately when they arrive at when they trickle down to the local level. So the Government Accountability Office, the major economic monitoring organization of the US government, is predicting that property tax revenues aren't going to return to their 2009 levels until 2039. This is a major, the largest single revenue source for cities and municipalities. And so they are going to have low revenues, reduced revenues for the medium term. This is not just a cyclical effect, of course, here. And the state and local government fiscal gap is now recognized to be structural. According to the Government Accountability Office, with no policy change, expenditure reductions of nearly 13% a year will be required in the local government and city government system every year till 2062. So what this does is lock in through financial discipline a model of lean local government, no matter what its contradictions and limitations. It becomes financially pre-given almost. And just this week in The Economist magazine, this week's issue, The Economist, of course, pursuing a somewhat neoliberal line itself, expresses some surprise here that a number of American states continue to face a revenue crisis, even as the broader economy enters its 9th year of recovery. State fiscal policy is driven largely by the booms and busts of the business cycle. The Economist reports as if this is just a natural fact. This is a product of the neoliberalization of the budgetary process. States nationwide have been raiding rainy day funds and using other gimmicks to balance budgets. Such maneuvers cannot conceal forever the larger crisis in revenue raising, which is especially painful for Republican-run states that have spent years loudly slashing taxes and then more quietly cutting services to plug budget holes. A backlash is brewing. Teachers' strikes of this year hit West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Kentucky. Teachers in Arizona are about to follow suit. Even the most conservative states are having hard conversations about revenues. In Oklahoma, for example, the Republican governor has just signed a bill that would increase education spending by $400 million, which is the first tax rise in the state for 28 years. So these political conditions of driving the impacts of cuts down to the local level and of states pushing them on to cities and municipalities have got limits even for Republican reformers, even though at some level they may be thriving under these circumstances politically. They may be running out of options to manage what is increasingly becoming a night watchman state in many cities and municipalities. This gives you just an image that captures the way in which downturns are being managed in the public sector. This is local government employment, which is the largest area of expenditure for most local governments, and what's happened to it in the months immediately following a recession. You'll see a mid-1970s recession would follow a classic Keynesian model, where government spending would increase during an economic downturn. The neoliberal model, first introduced by Reagan, but also seen after 2008, is one of cutting back the state in the context of a recession itself. If I continue this line forward further a few more months, you would see that the level of losses of local government employment after 2008 have been greater than any time in US history, and the line past the Reagan recession in terms of its long-term impact. So we're in a different way of managing budgetary discipline and responding to crises. The detail on this map isn't important other than for you to absorb the general point that the impact of these fiscal pressures was felt unevenly in different parts of the country. It wasn't, even though there's a generalized downward process of financial discipline, it's not felt equally in one place, one city, one state, and another. It is felt rather unevenly. Likewise, the map of municipal bankruptcies is scattered right across from coast to coast. Municipal bankruptcies don't really solve major problems. You can't liquidate a city, so going through a bankruptcy is a real last resort for city managers and for those that lend the money. It's a very blunt instrument used only in absolutely desperate circumstances. You have Michigan here, Detroit is one of the most famous of these bankruptcies, but they were scattered across the system. A point to note, though, is that municipal bankruptcies are rare events, extremely rare. There are thousands of local jurisdictions in the US. This is a kind of map of the very sharpest end of the financial crisis. Most local municipalities will be managing fiscal stress in the shadow of bankruptcy and will do everything they can to avoid this desperate situation. So municipal bankruptcies only give you a certain view of this situation, not a full picture. Another thing to mention here, I'll just go on to the next slide first. One of the things that is associated or with bankruptcy or used instead of a bankruptcy is what's called emergency management. Emergency management involves the placement of a state-appointed financial manager in control of the city and essentially disempowers elected officials. This is the emergency manager of the city of Detroit, Kevin Orr, standing here in front of the elected mayor of Detroit at the time, who has largely lost most of his powers when the Republican governor, standing on the other side there, decided to appoint an emergency manager. So this is a form of, these people have been called financial czars because they have rather sweeping powers to privatize, to void contracts with unions or suppliers, to restructure operations, to cut taxes, to cut expenditure. And they do so without any political accountability at all. You suspend most of the powers of the mayor and elected officials when you appoint an emergency manager. As Kevin Orr said when he took over in Detroit, I'm not a political animal, I'm a restructuring professional, and I'm going to function in that capacity. He promised to introduce the rule of reason to Detroit, and he would do so as a specialist in corporate bankruptcies. That was his expertise prior to this moment. So emergency management can be a prelude to bankruptcy. Sometimes it's a substitute to it. In Detroit's case, it was Kevin Orr that took the city through bankruptcy and negotiated its settlement. In other cities, emergency management has been used on its own. Now, this chart here gives you a sense of how emergency management is being used in the state of Michigan. There are 10 million people live in Michigan. 1 million of them live in cities that have got an emergency manager, Detroit being the biggest, but there are many others. There are dozens of other cases of this. So about 10% of the population lives under an emergency manager. But notice that 52% of the African American population of Michigan is under emergency management, compared to less than 3% of the white population of the state. So emergency management is a strategy that's applied especially to poorer cities that have experienced long-run economic decline. Many of them are African-American majority cities in Michigan, often with elected officials from the African-American community. And so this is a clearly inequitable strategy, selectively imposed on black cities and cities with black mayors. In terms of, we can then kind of understand the impact of some of these restructuring strategies in that context. This is what the Michigan's conservative think tank, the Mackinac Center, believes that Detroit needed to do as it entered bankruptcy. Let Detroit save itself by fundamentally reforming the city's government and business climate. Let Detroit save itself and better serve its residents through comprehensive program of privatizing city services. Let Detroit save itself by repealing the city's income tax and downsizing its bureaucracy, rolling back the regulatory burden on city businesses. So this is conventional neoliberal treatment, of course, applied in the context of that axiom of fiscal federalism, where Detroit has to essentially try to manage its own finances without large transfers from the state or the federal level, or indeed across from other cities. So the pure conservative position then is that cities manage these stresses on their own. So let me just wind up by saying a couple of things about what austerity urbanism means as a general phenomenon, and then I'll end with possibly some questions for discussion. First of all, austerity means lean local government, lean cities, enforced government downsizing, cutting of programs, cutting of local government employment. It's meant a new wave of privatizations and fire sales of public assets. If you're a city that has to live within your means, you'll be forced to sell off more or less anything of value immediately under the need to meet a balanced budget and so on. What this means is that cities have, again, sold their most marketable assets and are left with the most difficult to manage assets, which are going to remain on the public books in the future. So the process of municipal governance becomes more challenging after you've sold off your marketable assets. Permanent fiscal stress becomes a kind of headwind for local political action, constraining to a certain extent, possibly even the imagination, but the practical limits for local actors. There's an anti-tax drag, which becomes intensified under these conditions. It's brave politicians that would propose increases in taxes under the context of recession and austerity. Emergency rule imposing forms of crisis management, especially on poorer cities with majority populations, has become commonplace. There's a general climate of redoubled urban competition, and so cities will have to scramble for any economic or public resources that might be available or otherwise footloose. And I think there's a increased reliance on symbolic development projects. My favorite target here is Richard Florida and his creative cities model, This is an almost entirely empty strategy that costs nothing really to implement. It allows politicians to make inflated claims without committing any new public spending. Is almost an entirely symbolic initiative with all kinds of negative implications attached to it. My point, though, is that for politicians to launch meaningful urban economic development strategies in this context is almost impossible. Those that would involve major commitments of public funds, the building of new institutions, the creation of new state agencies or capacities, that's very, very difficult in this climate, so you rely more on symbolic projects. Last major slide I want to use is to just comment on some of the ways in which these developments might involve a financialization of urban governance more generally. So lots of neoliberal tactics are being used here, but also we can locate this and think in terms of the longer term movements of financialization. So part of the picture here is what I've called municipal Calvinism, this spirit that cities get what they deserve, that cities that have run up deficits like Detroit, that was caused by bad behavior in the past and profligacy and weak financial management. And so this idea that the sinners must pay for the sins is really built into this model. There's an operational matrix of normalized budgetary restraint, which increases the cyclicality of public spending, which means that mandates are likely to be unfunded at the local level, that cities are responsibilized for all kinds of social and economic and ecological costs that they will have great difficulty responding to and managing. There's a generalized imposition of bondholder value disciplines on cities, reflecting increasing dependence in the United States anyway, on the municipal bond market, on credit rating agencies which affect the price of borrowing and so on. There's a shift from a popular model of urban political economy in the 1970s and 80s was the urban growth machine. In some respects, we're looking at urban growth debt machines now, based on lean administration, privatization and monetization of assets, systematic rollbacks. And the imposition of these Caesarist, highly authoritarian strategies, including by so-called non-interventionist politicians on the right, seem to suggest a new, tougher climate for municipal management, including the circumvention of local democratic control in cities like Detroit. So it's possible then to see this pattern of deep financialization as a late entrepreneurial condition for cities, cities that have used all of the strategies in the entrepreneurial playbook to try to grow their way into prosperity, now have to cut their way to prosperity. They have to cut the public sector in order to reduce the city to reduced means. So to end, maybe these are some questions we can talk about in discussion. One of the questions is, what can we conclude about the evolving geographies of austerity? This is both intra-national and international. Europe had a different experience of austerity to North America, although I would argue there are some common themes, such as devolving the pain and the costs of austerity to the local level. What room is there for maneuver or space for action for progressive political forces at the urban scale, given the diminution of state resources and the generally adverse financial climate that austerity has brought, and to some extent locked in the medium term? Does the austerity moment signal another endgame for devolved neoliberalism? Are we to declare yet another death of the neoliberal project? Does it otherwise mean the normalization of a financialized model of governance that is being imposed on cities? Or does it mean something else altogether? I think I would argue that austerity urbanism was a sort of conjunctural concept improvised to try to explain a fast-moving situation immediately following the financial crash. Now, with what we make of it with some benefit of hindsight and wider experience, I think might enable us to locate it in these broader theoretical and political histories. But I'll stop there, and thanks for your attention. Happy to join the conversation now.
Jamie, very much for the presentation. So it's open for debate and questions. Guys, use your microphones if you can, or otherwise type your questions and comments in the chat. Go ahead if you want. Could you hear me? Was it clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So, Jamie, thanks again. If nobody's having a question right now, I have two comments and a question. And specifically your last slide. I'm not sure what we can conclude so far, but you were talking about the neoliberals using new strategies, supposedly even surprising strategies, advocating more state and very vigorous state interventions, and it seemed to me that it's just another and very good example for how they appropriate the state, the government, for using it not in towards their objectives. And I really like, well, it's a bit scary. It's not about liking. It's rather scary than liking. Them using the emergency states to restructure, fundamentally the local economic and social structures. So I'm wondering, and this is a bit in terms of your last slide as well. These austerity measures, they don't seem to work at all economically. I mean, we have mounting empiric evidence from Greece, for example, in Europe and other places that it's not working, and still the discourse is there and seems strong. And so my question is, or like, I'm wondering, when does this discourse just become pure fake news, pure facade, and the objective empiric evidence is so strong that even conservative think tanks and researchers cannot deny it. And the other comment I would have on this, that the case of Detroit is very interesting because in some senses the Detroit could recover itself through very progressive and alternative practices. For example, after the crash, there was a huge increase in community gardens, very local civil society-based initiatives that took up the vacuum, the spaces that were just left by the Australian government. And so instead of creating this self-sufficiency that has been advocated by the neoliberals, and you mentioned that in your talk, there seems to be a space, geographies of progressive movements in these austerity plagued places. So yeah, just a good comment, and perhaps other people want to jump in.
Great, thank you. Well, should respond to those? They're big questions, so maybe I'll just respond to those first. In terms of the emergency state, Stuart Hall used to say in the 1990s that the third way might be the best political shell for neoliberalism, like the most positive story that could be told about neoliberal governance was the one that Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and others tried to tell in the mid to late 1990s. I think what we've seen globally in the last decade is the complete failure of that centrist story that embraces globalization and the need for welfare reform and so on. And increasingly, the neoliberal strategy is hard to sell, I think, through conventional democratic channels. and so we might be moving towards a situation where rather than the best shell or the most positive story that you could wrap around neoliberal reforms, we're now seeing a hard shell, a hardening of political structures around the defense of a neoliberal project, which always did. I mean, ever since Pinochet, obviously, could live alongside authoritarian strategies. We over the years were repeatedly told that political freedom and economic freedom were naturally traveled together, and that liberal democracy was the optimal environment for neoliberal transformation. But in fact, I would argue right from the beginning, neoliberalism never had a fixed or necessary relationship with democratization and electoral politics. It could exist with authoritarian systems just as well, if not better, than with liberal democracies. And so we could say that neoliberalism is a kind of reverting to type, reverting to its original hard interventionist form a la Chile 1973. Or I would say more accurately, it's gone through an historical process of political hardening. And the fact that it doesn't work economically becomes something which has to be kind of managed politically, but also is hardly a surprise. Neoliberal strategies never did deliver high growth, for example, generally lower rates of growth than Keynesian strategies have delivered. And so, because neoliberalism has never really delivered on its economic promises, it's been a constant process of shifting political rationales and strategies accompanying this continuing thread of advocacy of neoliberal reforms. So we know from even the IMF will now recognize that austerity doesn't work as a macro strategy. It does, however, work for the very wealthy. It works for the 1%. It defends their wealth. It redistributes the pain of restructuring onto other classes and social groups. So it's kind of brutally effective for the 1%, even if it manifestly fails to deliver for the population as a whole. And in countries where austerity has been a kind of official political position, as in the UK, for example, the UK said that the Conservative government in the UK said it would be years and years and years before the country would emerge out of austerity. And now they're in the Brexit crisis and other things. So there is no, neoliberal politicians can no longer promise that improvement that Reagan and Thatcher, for example, both promised that. There was a sunlit future that awaited when we could only get rid of the unions and all these obstacles to growth. Everybody would be prosperous and happy. That story won't work anymore. I don't think the public buys that. There's no evidence that it's the case. So I think we've got a kind of legitimation crisis spawned by the events of 2008, which is being responded to by this kind of authoritarian turn in the more typical patterns of neoliberal governance. So you'd see echoes then between conditions in Detroit, Greece, Brazil, China, Russia, in lots of the kind of frontiers of growth not too long ago, or frontiers of development we've now seen a kind of hardening of politics. So I think that's not just a coincidence. It's not just explained by local specificities. I think there's something about the kind of neoliberal, the late neoliberal conditions that essentially mean these contradictions and limits have had to be confronted. On whether these conditions provide opportunities for progressive groups, there's a great book called DIY Detroit, which explores what has been happening in that city in the wake of 2008. And what that shows is, there is a progressive version of self-sufficiency which has emerged in the context of the crisis. There's a lot more kind of progressive self-help and experimentation at the very local level, which is, could easily be a seedbed for alternative projects, but at the same time must exist in the pores of a extremely challenging environment at the metropolitan and wider scale. So this is not to say that those strategies are unimportant. I mean, they may be really all we have as an inspiration for alternative left and progressive projects. But we also have to recognize that they are symptomatic of the weakness of the left, that the only room for maneuver now is often at the very local level. And I think in terms of a broader left politics, I would say we need to find strategies for radical progressive redistribution, which are really wildly beyond the scope of local action. I mean, we have to start there, you could argue, but the horizon of action has clearly got to exceed the local. At the moment, the horizons of action for many organizations have been reduced to the local. And I think that is one of the more challenging aspects of the times.
Well, thank you. That really was a great answer. And there was a very interesting question by Paul in our chat. I'll just read it to you. My question relates to the relative optimism of the new localism agenda, besides Bruce Katz and Novak, versus the constrained headroom for innovation you highlight. Beyond the city-led progressive political project, do you see any scope or areas for movement as local areas come under increasing pressure?
Well, that's a great question. I think that is maybe that's the big question. That's where Jakob's question ended as well. One would have to be very pessimistic to say that there's no prospects for any of those movements. To a certain extent, the politics have to begin from where we are. Where we are in scalar terms, where we are, what the issues that are currently confronted. And so while I'll be skeptical of the really rosy-eyed versions of the new localism, it may have to be the case that that alternative political strategies are partly built from roots at that scale. But again, I would say the horizons of action have got to exceed the local scale. Otherwise, it remains the case that local strategies in poor cities are structurally limited, while those in wealthy cities with access to the bond market and so on are more open. We shouldn't freeze the current pattern of inequality and insist that local strategies are all that there can be, because I think we've got to imagine a wider horizon for action. And there are periods in the past when this has been the case. In my own experience, the municipal socialist moment in Britain in the early 1980s, in the teeth of Thatcher, the early advance of Thatcherism, that was built from the local level. It was about Labour Party controlled municipalities working together and networking and trying to build what they called demonstration projects, left demonstration projects that could move laterally from place to place and build networks that would sustain that. I think we've seen glimpses of that with the living wage movement would be one example of that in more recent times. A host of local environmental initiatives and so on that are, it's a sense of kind of left version of model building. And what I think progressive forces need to do, amongst other things, is to figure out how to build channels of communication and sharing and the protection of demonstration projects and prototypes and so on, to enrich the strategies that can be developed at the local level, while also pushing for control of, for political control at higher spatial scales. I think that unfortunately that remains pretty significant. In the United States, the Republican control of the state apparatus of the 50 states is more extended now than it has been since the 1930s, possibly even the 20s. So there's an unprecedented level of control of conservative political forces of the apparatus of government. So, you know, never believe the neoliberal reformer who tells you that they really aren't interested in government, they're only interested in what spontaneous private forces can achieve. They know fully the power of government. It's a strategy to capture and reuse the government resources for conservative and neoliberal ends. And so recapturing and repurposing the state, I think, has to be on the agenda beyond localism itself, or some of the islands of inspiration that we can see on the landscape now. In the United States, Jackson, Mississippi would be one of the places where you have a progressive administration really trying to do, to push a radical agenda, but within fantastic political and fiscal constraints. I mean, it's an extremely tough environment, but it may well be the case that these difficult circumstances bring forth different kinds of responses, resistances, and alternative strategies.
Well, thank you very much. I would agree on most of that. So we already hit the 1 hour point. So if there are still questions, let's have one or maximum two if there are. Otherwise,
can I jump in?
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah, sorry, I had a problem unmuting my microphone here. So I was thinking about how when the 2008 crisis came, we had this feeling here that it's something that happened here many times, and in Latin America, right, since the early 90s, and there was a feeling that well, it's finally hitting the main epicenter of the international financial system. And it's very interesting to hear you talk about these things, because we look at and we see parallels to the stories that have been unfolding here in many different ways, and there are so many interesting comparisons to be made. And we're of course living through a new wave of restructuring, which is plainly, openly authoritarian, right? Of course, the discourse, it's not open in the discourse level, but it's over there for everyone to see that it's an authoritarian neoliberal fix, and which is, you know, this characteristic of the project of always renewing itself and always reinventing things that need to be done. But what we see there is that throughout this history since the early 90s is that the social, and that's happening right now again in the federal level here, and it's a pattern of the social, the cuts in social spending as a form of creating markets, mainly in the collective services, right? And also of creating ways to manage or to increase a certain labor supply, let's say. And then comes the financialization, which will reach property and etc. But I was thinking about the new agencies that we've been seeing here, and they're mostly local and mostly in the big cities, and that manage the state, the receivables. They're new like policy experiments. It's a brand new kind of policy experiment, and people are seeing that it works as a way to dodge the fiscal disciplining of the local governments in different ways that will go in the direction of finance. So they, in Belo Horizonte, for example, there's one called PBH Ativos, which is PBH is the city management and Ativos is assets. And it's basically a local agency that manages all of the city's assets, and it's mainly land, and also the receivables. I don't know the English for this. The tax.
Tax receipts.
Tax receipts that haven't been paid by debtors, right?
Aha.
And so this agency, they get the right to go after people who are in debt with the city, so that they can collect taxes that are late, and that becomes an asset itself.
Yeah.
So and then they can actually sell bonds and all sorts of different. We're still trying to figure it out, and it's all very strange and full of new things, and we have this feeling that we don't have access to all the information that is needed to properly understand what's going on there. But what I sense is that they're testing new forms of finance to reach things that have been inside the walls of the state, let's say.
Right.
And things that are profitable for finance, right? And so there's a shift there from a long-range historical shift from the old ways that there was a Keynesian form of creating debt, which of course the banks would jump in and provide finance, which is profitable for them as well. And now they're finding new ways to, dodge the local fiscal responsibility laws. Right. And create new forms that finance can act through the state. So I'm thinking that all goes in the direction of maybe we're living through a deeper transformation of the state itself, and a financialization of the state itself, and transformation of the state finance nexus. And right. That's going in. You finished with or is this something new? I'm thinking that it could be politically, right? And of course, the authoritarian wave is not a coincidence with the appearance of these things.
Yeah, I mean those are great points. I think you've got in each wave of neoliberal transformation, there are these new projects of statecraft and reconfiguration, especially involving organizations that are sometimes called the shadow state or the para-state, or immediately which are in the state's orbit, but not necessarily staffed by state employees or under direct democratic control. So that there's wave upon wave of these. Yeah, Mrs. Thatcher in the 1980s used to call the little platoons of society that would come in, and voluntary action and so on, that would take over social services, that would run libraries and so on. This is part of the neoliberal imagination, that these spontaneous forms of social action will fill the vacuum left by the retreating state. But if that's the story that neoliberals, the kind of fairy tale that they like to tell, I think they know full well, and they certainly know now, that what they actually need to do is to constantly re-engineer institutions and strategies to try to kind of manage the contradictions of neoliberal transformation at, around, or beyond the boundaries of the state itself. So you certainly get a change in the shape of the state. And I think this is one of the reasons, some of the things that you talk about here, Felipe, are the reasons that it's important to have a conception of neoliberalization and financialization that extends across multiple situations, contexts, conjunctures. Not to say all of these experiences are the same, but to hold them side by side, and because the alternative extreme position is that all of these experiences are sui generis, de novo, entirely invented locally, and which is clearly bogus. There may not be copies of something from somewhere else, but they exist in a lineage, a political lineage and political networks that they can draw resources from the outside. You know, a privatization measure pursued today exists in a vast library of privatization projects and in networks of parallel privatizations. And so for these reasons, I think we need to work across cases, national situations, different historical moments and so on, to find not repeating and replicating phenomena, but constant reconfigurations of an ongoing process, which of course need not, although it might feel like that at the present time, need not be able to keep this music playing forever. I mean, it may, it's, I often say that neoliberalism has 9 lives, and maybe it's survived 6 of them already. But at some point, this is not for eternity. So it begs the question of how it will ultimately unravel. I don't think the neoliberal hegemony and financial hegemony will unravel with one local failure. I don't think it will unravel even with a local failure at the very epicenter, as you said, the project. That used to be a typical answer on the left. That once the contradictions went to the heart and brain of the process, once they hit New York and London and the real power centers, once they went into crisis, then surely the game will be up. What we know, I think, post-2008 is that the neoliberal project exists in a different way to that. It doesn't just trickle, it doesn't just get imposed from the capitals of Washington, D.C. It has become embedded and entrenched in a whole series of political settlements which reproduce its power simultaneously. So the world of financialization and neoliberalization is multipolar and complex and reproduced through multiple sites simultaneously. So it is interesting and revealing that 2 countries which were at the very forefront of neoliberal and financial reform in the 1980s appear to be suffering some of the deepest contradictions of their own project now, the UK and the US. So that's an interesting pattern. But as you say, many other parts of the world have experienced these pressures and challenges and crises almost on a continuous level, such that the language of crisis itself perhaps isn't appropriate. So we need to have a broader spectrum analysis of this kind of phenomena that takes account of these multiple strategies, because we don't really know. I mean, there's constant experimentation with new strategies of government on the right, and there ought to be reciprocating strategies on the left and in progressive ways as well. But it may be that many of the right's projects are crisis driven, but they've proved in the past to be quite creative about the use of these circumstances. And it's easier for them to use the circumstances than it is progressives, because progressives may need governmental capacity. They may need fiscal transfers to make their projects actually work and gain traction. Whereas the right is often satisfied with localized, isolated responses and devolution and disaggregation. Reaggregation is a more challenging political project, I think.
That was more than an answer to that.
Not hearing you.
Oh, sorry. Thanks again for the answer, for the response. And so as we already passed our mark, I'd say, and there's nothing to add to that last response of yours from my point of view. If somebody wants to jump in with a quick comment, last chance. Otherwise, I would already thank Jamie very much for the time and sharing his knowledge with us here, and thanks for the comments, Philippe. Highlight again, everybody, that there are several call for papers open for the Latin American convening of the Young Scholar Initiative. So if you haven't seen that, contact us directly or go to the Young Scholar directory and you'll see that. Thanks again, Jamie, for being here, sharing, and
thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, we hope to get more of you in the future.
Okay. Goodbye.
Have a nice day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.